For as long as I've lived out here, where the nearest town is a 20-minute drive and the nights are so dark, you can almost hear the stars. Mr. Abernathy's barn light was a constant. It wasn't a harsh, modern floodlight, but a single, soft yellow bulb encased in a rusted metal cage, mounted high on the peak of his weathered red barn. It cast a gentle, lonely glow over his property, a small circle of civilization and a vast sea of cornfields and woods. I never thought much of it. Really, it was just part of the landscape, like the crooked fence post at the end of my driveway or the V-shape of geese flying south in the fall. Mr. Abernathy himself was much the same, a quiet fixture of a man, built from the same sturdy, weathered material as his barn. We weren't friends, not in the traditional sense. We were neighbors in the old, rural way, which meant we'd wave from our tractors, nod at the feed store, and offer a hand if a truck got stuck in the mud. He was a widower, I knew that much, and folks said he lived on that plot of land his entire life, working the soil until his hands were as gnarled as oak roots. His routine was as predictable as the seasons, and the barn light was the final punctuation mark on his day. It would click on right around dusk, and I'd see his silhouette move across the yard one last time before he went inside for the night. The light, to me, simply meant that Abernathy was home, that all was right in our quiet corner of the world. Then, last winter, the world shifted. The cold came down hard and fast, the kind that steals your breath and makes the trees crack like rifle shots in the night. The news of his passing came the way it always does out here, a call from another neighbor. A somber note passed through the community grapevine. He died peacefully in his sleep, they said, an old man who had simply run out of time. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of distant relatives and the few of us who knew him by a wave and a nod. In the days that followed, I'd look over at his property and feel a strange emptiness, the house dark, the driveway unplowed. But the barn light stayed on. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I figured one of his relatives, in their grief and haste to handle his affairs, had simply forgotten to flip the switch. A week went by, then two. Snow fell, burying his driveway and piling up against the silent house. But every single evening, as the sun bled out behind the horizon, the little yellow bulb would flicker to life, a steadfast beacon over an empty farm. It started to unnerve me. It was no longer a comforting part of the landscape. It was a question mark hanging in the dark. I started running through logical explanations. A timer, maybe. Abernathy was old school, but he wasn't against modern convenience. Still, it seemed odd to put a single barn light on a timer. Maybe it was a dusk to dawn sensor, the kind that turns on automatically when it gets dark. That seemed more plausible. But my own security lights sometimes failed in the brutal cold or got confused on overcast days. His never did. It was perfect, punctual, almost deliberate. As winter deepened, my curiosity curdled into a low-grade obsession. I find myself watching from my kitchen window, waiting for it to turn on, half expecting that one night it wouldn't. But it always did. I started to wonder about the man I'd only known from a distance. What did the light mean to him? Was he afraid of the dark? Was it for security? Or was it something else? I began asking around, subtly. At the post office, I mentioned the light to our mail carrier, who'd known Abernathy for 30 years. He just shrugged and said, "Old Gus was a man of habit. Guess that was just one of them." It felt like a dead end. The property sat empty for months, a for sale sign eventually appearing at the end of the lane, its red letters a stark slash against the white snow. Still, the light burned on. Finally, in early spring, as the thaw was beginning to set in, I saw a car I didn't recognize pull into his driveway. It was a real estate agent showing the place to a young couple, on a whim. Driven by months of unanswered questions, I put on my boots, walked over, and introduced myself. The agent was friendly, and the couple seemed nice, full of dreams about starting a small organic farm. I made small talk before finally just asking the question that had been haunting me. It's probably a silly question, I said, pointing toward the barn. But do you know why that barn light is always on? It's been on every night since Mr. Abernathy passed. The agent smiled a sad, gentle smile. Oh, that, she said softly. His daughter told me about it. It's not on the main grid. She explained that Gus Abernathy, years and years ago, after a particularly bad ice storm knocked out the power for over a week, had become worried. Not for himself, but for his wife, Eleanor, who had a deep, paralyzing fear of the dark that stemmed from a childhood trauma. So, he'd saved up and bought a small solar panel and a deep cycle marine battery, rigging up a system that was completely independent, dedicated to that one single bulb. His goal, his promise to her, was that no matter what happened, no storm, no blackout, no failure of the power company, she would always have a light. Eleanor had passed away nearly a decade before him, but Gus never turned it off. It was a promise he kept, a nightly vigil for the woman he loved. He wasn't keeping the darkness out of the barn, he was keeping it out of her memory. I stood there, the mud of the melting snow cold through the soles of my boots, and stared at that simple, rusted light fixture. It was no longer a mystery, no longer an eerie ghost light. It was a testament. It was a love story told in a single, unwavering watt of electricity. The young couple bought the farm, and I was worried they'd tear the old barn down or at least fix the wiring. But I told them the story, and now, every evening as the sun sets, I look out my window, and the light still clicks on, a quiet, yellow star keeping a silent promise in the vast, rural dark, and that's something worth remembering when you next see a lone light burning in the distance.